Y doy ahora la palabra al representante de Líbano.
Thank you, Mr. President. The situation in the Palestinian occupied territories is indeed alarming. According to UN OCHA, the past 2 weeks have witnessed the highest number of fatalities and injuries in the West Bank as of 2005. This in itself not only justifies the call for this high-level debate, which we would like to thank Spain for organizing, it also calls for swift action on behalf of this august body. Since the beginning of this month, 2 Palestinians on average have been killed on a daily basis, and over 1,000 injured, let alone increasing settlers' attacks on Palestinian property. Israeli provocations and assaults on the Haram Sharif have not stopped in obvious attempts to change the agreed upon status quo by seeking to establish a temporal, if not geographical, division of the holy site, contrary to what Mr. Netanyahu claims. Israel, the occupying power, is acting one more time in total disregard to its obligations under international law and international humanitarian law to protect the civilian Palestinians. Hence, our call to this Council, one more time, to resort to all ways and means at its disposal to ensure the protection of the endangered lives and properties of Palestinians living under Israeli occupation, pending this Council's assumption of its full duties and responsibilities to put an end to the Israeli occupation and help the Palestinian state achieve its independence. Mr. President, the events of the past months are but the tip of the iceberg of occupation, which is now almost 50 years long. As a matter of fact, we need to provide for an international protection for the Palestinians under Israeli occupation becomes self-evident if we simply recall the fate of the most vulnerable, that is the Palestinian children under occupation. And only to note that one Palestinian child was killed by the Israeli occupying forces every 3 days between 2000 and 2013. And that 62% of the 95,000 Palestinian children who have been detained by the Israelis since 1967 have likely been subjected to some form of physical violence. And how can one not mention the case of the 2 Palestinian children who were recently burned to death by extremist Israeli settlers? The 18-month-old Ali Dawabshi, who was killed in July 2015 in an arson attack in Douma, and Muhammad Abu Khdair, the 16-year-old Palestinian, who was kidnapped, beaten, and burned alive by Israeli settlers in East Jerusalem in August 2014. Mr. President, notwithstanding such acts of appalling savagery, Benjamin Netanyahu, in a total contempt to our intelligence, dared to claim in his latest speech before the General Assembly that, and I quote, Israel is civilization's front line in the battle against barbarism, end of quote. Moreover, instead of facing the reality of the occupation and its inherently oppressive structure and repressive methods, Israeli officials and propagandists endeavor to represent the mounting violence in the West Bank and Gaza as an eruption of so-called terrorist hatred motivated by nothing else but pure anti-Semitism and bloodthirsty Islamic fanaticism. Mr. President, I am sure that you have recognized here a familiar situation of blaming the victim, only reminiscent of William Ryan's Blaming the Victim famous book, a 1971 classic work in which it's shown how victim blaming functions as an ideology used to divert responsibility and to justify racism and social injustice. In fact, blaming the victim is so odious that it was rightly depicted by one of the great 20th century thinkers as, and I quote, one of the most sinister features of the fascist character. Mr. President, in Israel, like elsewhere, racism is not only blind, but deadly too. Let's only consider how on Monday, Haftoum Zarhoum, an innocent Eritrean asylum seeker fleeing the scene of acts of violence, was shot, then lynched. This dismaying attack is documented in videos in which an angry Israeli mob is shown hurling benches and chairs and kicking him in the head, assuming he was an Arab terrorist just because he was dark-skinned, all the while screaming things like death to Arabs. Worth asking Mr. Netanyahu whether this is also another example of Israel as, and I quote, civilization's front line in the battle against barbarism. Obviously, we do not have the same lexicon as Mr. Netanyahu. For in our lexicon, racism and xenophobia, let alone acts of burning people alive and of lynching, are examples of barbarism and not of civilization. Mr. President, in conclusion, allow me to repeat that the situation in the Palestinian occupied territories is very alarming. Not only can this Council prevent the situation from further deteriorating, it can also unlock the path to a just and durable peace in the Middle East, provided it resolves to act on the basis of the principles and rules of international law and of international humanitarian law. Here, seeking balance where no balance exists or can exist, as between the occupier and the occupied, is no justice. It is not even a travesty of justice. It is injustice to core. Conversely, pending the end of the Israeli occupation, this Council can and must move now to provide international protection to the Palestinian people. The sooner the better, for the relevance of this Council, and above all, for the just cause of peace in our part of the world. Thank you, Mr. President.
Muchísimas gracias al representante de Líbano. Voy a dar la palabra